It might be time to start cutting ties with some of your favorite highly drafted players, Jason. Plus, injuries. We got a fantasy doctor who goes by Fantasy Docs. He's going to be telling us what to do, how we should attack Week 5. The Fantasy GOAT starts right now.
This is the Fantasy GOAT, sponsored by Casablanca Resort and Casino, like Vegas used to be.
Welcome, kids. That's Jason Feinberg. I'm Mike Davis. This is the Fantasy GOAT, Jason. We're entering Week 5. A lot of injuries to talk about. We got a great doctor from Northwestern, a sports physician. We're going to be talking to him a little later. But a lot of cutting ties with potential players that were drafted pretty high. We're going to be getting that in GOAT Vision. But let's kick off right now. What do you want to say about cutting ties?
I was just going to say, it reminds me of when our parents used to say to us, Michael, not Mike, but Michael, I'm disappointed in you. That's how I feel about a lot of my fantasy football players.
When you say Michael and not Mike, you know it's serious.
It's serious,
That's how it works, kids. So let's do this. Let's enter into livestock right now. The big question on everybody's mind, especially for people like me who drafted a guy like Cooper Kupp in the first round, especially in your league. Is this guy, as he's coming back for Week 5, practicing finally, is he going to be the Cooper Kupp we know and love? And what is that going to mean for breakout star Puka Nacua? How are you feeling about this whole Kupp-Nacua situation?
As a Puka owner, now I do have Kupp in one league, but I have Puka in 3, and I had to use some fat money to get him. I'm nervous because if you think about Matt Stafford, he's accomplished a lot. He's got the ring and everything and whatnot. But one thing that he doesn't do a whole lot is distribute the ball. So if Cooper Kupp comes back and how much he's used, I'm afraid that Puka will see a lot of his time and yardage and completions dwindle. But I still think he'll be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, they could help each other out, but it's just amazing still as a rookie. Over 500 yards, him and Justin Jefferson, the only guys with over 500 yards, 39 receptions, finally found the end zone last week in that game winner. So it's going to be interesting. I'm more down on Tutu Atwell, even though he's been playing well. I think that's the guy who's going to feel the negative effects of Cooper coming back as much as anybody else. But we got Dr. Nithin Natwa, who's going to be actually speaking to what he anticipates in terms of Cooper Kupp's readiness in his return. So we got that. But let's move on now to another big-time topic, Joe Burrow, Jason. I mean, this guy has been so disappointing for fantasy football managers, and it's really a negative situation for everybody on that team, from Chase to Higgins to Mixon. Let me just give you a stat real quick here. Joe Burrow, last year, 1 TD pass he was averaging every 16.3 attempts. This year, it's every 75.5 attempts.
I miss that, man.
I miss him too.
Right?
This guy is QB 31, kids.
Well, who's 30 or who's 29?
Like people ahead of him, Jason?
Yeah.
Jimmy G, Tannehill, Desmond Ridder.
Sorry.
Desmond Ridder is ahead of Joe Burrow.
So he's a Burrow, and he's got the calf, but he's not a fantasy GOAT right now.
Not at all. And we got to bring in our producer, James. James, tell us, I mean, should we be benching Joe Burrow at this juncture?
This one is really tough. If you want to bench him, I totally understand. Get rid of him completely, that's where I disagree. He's making it a really hard decision. He's averaging 4.8 yards per attempt. That's the lowest of his career and last among quarterbacks this season, which means he's getting the ball out quickly. He's throwing it underneath, throwing all these short routes. Why is he getting rid of the ball so quickly? His line is giving up a 25% pressure rate. He doesn't have time to throw the football. And with that bad calf, it's no wonder the offense is struggling, and no wonder they're 1-3. But the one thing I will say is that Burrow's never really had a great O-line in Cincinnati, and they've always managed to figure it out despite these slow starts. Zach Taylor's an offensive head coach. You got to assume they'll get it going, but I'm not getting rid of Joe Burrow quite yet.
And a great matchup. This is the week against Arizona.
To me, this is, I mean, I wouldn't play him,
Yeah.
But if you want to check this out, this is the last week. If he doesn't do something against Arizona, then we're in big time trouble,
Yeah.
kids. So bad news there. The other big thing we got to do a little bit of, because it's, Jason, I don't know if you know this, it's against the law to have a football show and not talk about Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift.
It is now.
Yes.
It's a new law.
It's a new law. It just came into effect. Are you sick of this? I mean, just be real with me.
I actually was okay with it. I like Taylor Swift. I like her music. I even saw her in concert at one point. Not this Eras tour, but before.
Did you bring my friendship bracelet, by the way?
I do. I have it in the car. Okay. Yeah. But where really jumped the shark to quote a sitcom that we all are familiar with the Fonz, is the Sunday night The Voice with Carson, right? And the cast of The Voice trying to explain to Swifties what football is.
On Sunday night.
It was just awful. It was embarrassing.
It's a weird situation, but listen, they're 2-0, so there is some magic since she's been in that stadium.
I kind of feel like they'd be 2-0 anyway.
Listen, they probably would be, but there's something going on there. Hey, listen, this brings us to a great part of our show right now. Guess what? It's the hole-in-one player of the week, Jason.
Yeah.
And guess who our hole-in-one player of the week is?
Well, there was two guys that came to mind, and one of them was Stephon Diggs, but you went with the other one, which I agree with.
Yes, it's Christian McCaffrey. Guys, Christian McCaffrey, personally, Jason, I feel like this guy is the MVP of the season now so far.
He's averaging more yards rushing than Joe Burrow is passing, if you think about it.
I mean, basically, let's just review what this guy is doing, okay? He has 6 TDs on the year. He scored over 20 fantasy points each and every week. Pretty incredible stuff. Last week, 20 attempts, 106 yards, 3 TDs.
Beautiful.
45 fantasy points.
Yeah.
He's the number 1 running back through weeks 1 through 4. So I anticipate him to just continue what he's doing. Shanahan and McCaffrey, it's a match made in heaven.
Yeah, and he is pretty much matchup proof, but he will have a good test against Dallas.
Yes,
this time.
But I think, this guy is the number 1 player in fantasy football. Guys, that's what we're talking about right now. Coming up after a short break, we got a lot more to tell you about GOAT Vision. We're diving into QBs and RBs. Make sure you stick around. We'll be right back after a short break.
Before we head to break, in Week 5 of 2013, this New Orleans running back had 9 catches for 55 yards and 2 touchdowns in a win versus Chicago, who finished as the week's running back 1. The answer after the break. Welcome back. Before the break, we asked you in Week 5 of 2013 which New Orleans running back had 9 catches for 55 yards and 2 touchdowns in a win versus Chicago. The answer, running back Pierre Thomas, who played for New Orleans from 2007 to 2014.
Welcome back, kids. All right, so Jason, let's start with QBs. Let's hear who you're loving right now.
I mean, after the game against Miami, you gotta love Josh Allen. They were going toe-to-toe for a little while, Josh and Tua, and then Josh Allen just took complete control of that game. Yeah. He found his boy, Stephon Diggs, for 3, and he was distributing the ball. Gabe Davis got involved.
And no turnovers. I mean, when Allen has no turnovers, that's an MVP quality QB.
He looked like he was on a mission during that game, so I'm pretty high on him.
Yeah.
How about you?
Me, Anthony Richardson.
Yeah.
I think this guy, let's face it, he's a top 10 fantasy QB, I think, for the rest of the season. With what he does on the ground and in the air, he's a really strong play. He had an incredible week. I think he's going to have another great week against Tennessee. And even with the prospect of Jonathan Taylor potentially returning and taking away some of that ground game and work, I still think Richardson is going to be such a threat. Yeah. And it might be one of those things where it actually helps him because there's another guy you have to consider on the ground who's an elevated talent.
Yeah, I think Moss will be the odd man out there, not so much Richardson when it comes to Taylor.
100%.
Yeah.
When I'm talking about guys I'm not feeling so much, Desmond Ridder. This guy is a disaster. 6 points in basically the past 2 weeks. He hasn't thrown for over 300 yards yet. 3 TDs, 3 INTs on the season. He's just not the answer in Atlanta, but he's still doing better than Joe Burrow when it comes to fantasy football.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing. Actually, thank goodness, at least for the Pacific time, that Atlanta played so early
Yes.
because we didn't have to watch that mess, that
Yeah.
disaster.
Over the pond.
Now who we
across the
did have
pond.
to watch
Yes.
was the former Las Vegas quarterback, Derek Carr. I think he came back too early from his injury, and it showed. And the biggest guy that was a victim, which we'll talk about soon, is Chris Olave. It was pathetic, that game. To have Baker Mayfield and that team with Evans injured and still go in and throttle them.
It's not a good thing. And Olave really, his production is dictated on the deep throw.
Right.
And if Carr can't throw that deep pass, Olave doesn't have the same value. But let's transition now to running backs. I mean, my gamble with producer James Edward Barrickman, the fourth, is looking really good. Kids at home. I am all in on Devon Achane, and I mean, he looks like the guy over Raheem Mostert, over 100 yards on the ground, added 2 TDs after that big explosion last week. So he really outproduced and outworked in terms of reps in that backfield, Raheem Mostert. Mostert literally had, 7 carries for 9 yards, 4 fantasy points. Meanwhile, Mostert, 8 carries, 101 yards.
Achane.
Achane, 8 carries, 101 yards, 2 TDs, 25 points.
Wow.
So, I mean,
Big
he
difference.
exploded, and it just looks like he might be that answer. Even in a slower week where Miami is not themselves, he still found the end zone.
Yeah, I wish I had him in at least one of my leagues, and I'm in multiple leagues. Who I do have in one league is the aforementioned Christian McCaffrey. We don't have to go back and talk about how great he is. So he's definitely up there, loving him. Here's one that is going to surprise you when it comes to running backs. I kind of was disappointed with. It's going to sound weird, but Alvin Kamara, he actually had a pretty good game fantasy-wise.
How many
he scored a
catches
lot
did
of
he
points.
have?
He had 13 catches, but here's the thing. For 33 yards.
Right.
That's really hard to do.
Yeah.
That's the only reason why I put him in that category.
I still kind of like that, though, for him in a PPR league.
PPR is great.
That's great. But Todd Bowles' defense in Tampa Bay, that's a well-coached team.
Yeah.
So they probably wrapped him up and anticipated that. The guy I'm not feeling so much, Miles Sanders, outsnapped and, outperformed by Chubba Hubbard, in Carolina. And, listen.
Possibly a little banged up, too.
He's a little banged up, but he had 4.7 points. But he's really a guy, if he's not getting in the end zone, he's not a great contributor. So I'm not feeling him this week, especially he's got to go against a tough Detroit defense now. So I think it's even weaker week for Miles Sanders. But that wraps up our running backs and QBs. Coming up after a short break, we're getting into that dreadful position we hate to talk about, tight ends. Kids, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. We'll be right back after a short break.
Before we head to break, in Week 5 of 2013, which Chicago wide receiver had 10 catches for 218 yards and 1 touchdown in a loss versus New Orleans? He finished as the week's wide receiver 1. The answer after the break. Welcome back. Before the break, we asked you which Chicago wide receiver had 10 catches for 218 yards and 1 touchdown in a loss versus New Orleans back in Week 5 of 2013. The answer, wide receiver Alshon Jeffrey, who played for Chicago from 2012 to 2016.
Welcome back, kids. All right, so Jason, let me kick off wide receivers for GOAT Vision. A sneaky solid season so far for a guy I have in 2 or 3 leagues, Marquise Brown in Arizona.
No.
This guy, listen, he's ahead of guys like DK Metcalf, Garrett Wilson, Jamar Chase, Olave, Cooper Ridley. Last week, 7 catches, 96 yards against San Fran. Loving this guy. He's definitely the top target for Joshua Dobbs.
I didn't realize you drafted him in so many leagues. That's great. Good for you.
Yeah.
I was afraid because I heard during the preseason that he wasn't getting any separation. But he's doing great.
Hey, it's Hollywood Brown.
Yeah.
You like Diggs.
Yeah, I like Diggs. It's pretty self-explanatory. He had 3 touchdowns. But what I really liked about that game is that he was avoiding tackles. It was, yards after contact.
Yak.
That was, the yak, right. So that was really cool. I am curious to see how he does when he travels overseas along with the rest of the team for Buffalo, because they have to go and play a well-rested Jacksonville team that just stayed in London.
But it was a good display, and we both share right now negative feelings for Chris Olave. We were talking about it earlier. If Carr is injured and his limitations on throwing the deep pass are that strained, well, Chris Olave, his production's dictated on the deep pass, so he's not going to be a great guy there.
Michael Thomas was getting all the receptions because he's the short reception
so
guy.
it's not a good situation there until he's healthy. Let's move on to tight end. So tight end wise, Dalton Kincaid, funny stat for you real quickly, in that Buffalo blowout game, Diggs was the story man of the afternoon, but actually, Dalton Kincaid was second in receptions and yards to Diggs. So he has definitely overtaken that tight end slot as the favorite compared to Dawson Knox for Josh Allen.
Here's another fun fact. Dalton Kincaid, there's a good chance that he watched me as a newborn because he's from Las Vegas.
Yes, Faith Lutheran.
Yeah,
so
from Faith Lutheran, and I've been here for a long time.
Yeah, that gives him another added benefit.
Yeah.
Who are you liking?
Well, for the same reason I'm disliking one guy, I'm liking Jonnu Smith. He goes over to Atlanta, and he's the guy, Desmond Ridder, when he does pass the ball, he's the one he's passing to.
Yeah.
And which makes sense because we don't like Kyle Pitts.
Let's just talk about this right now. I can't stand Kyle Pitts. You call him Pitts now. He's the Pitts.
Right.
He's the Pitts. I mean, listen, I don't know what else to say. 2 catches for 21 yards. He hasn't had a game with over 6 fantasy points all season. 4 targets. And the worst part you said, Jason, there's another tight end on the team in Atlanta that's doing better than him. I don't know what to say, but it's always that tight end position. Listen, guys, coming up after a short break, we got a great doctor. He goes by Fantasy Docs on IG. He's going to be helping us with some big injury issues heading into Week 5. Stick around. Jason, you're going to love this guy. So Dr. Nithin Natwa at Northwestern Medicine, he's a sports physician, goes by Fantasy Docs on IG and TikTok. This guy is a sports fanatic, a fantasy fanatic, but a physician who's going to give us some insight on everything we need to know when it comes to Cooper Kupp and Saquon Barkley. Here is the Fantasy Docs. Tell us what we need to know about Cooper Kupp. Should we be playing him? What would his production, you think, look like when he returns to the field?
Yes, Cooper Kupp was a player I was actually avoiding in the beginning of the season, and that's because of that hamstring strain. The hamstring injuries are of a bigger concern when a player is over the age of 30. So Cooper Kupp is right at that threshold, and they tend to linger a lot longer. On average, hamstring strains usually take about 4 to 5 weeks to recover from as well. I'm actually optimistic now about Kupp. So I think that I've gone from not being a huge fan of having him on my team to wanting to target him as a buy low target, because a lot of people are worried about how long this injury is going to linger for. But at his peak, Cooper Kupp is one of the best, if not the best, fantasy wide receiver to have on your squad. So with him having this IR stint where he was able to rest this hamstring appropriately, I am optimistic that he will return. Now, that's not to say he's not a high-risk player. He does have a risk of aggravating this hamstring, but as long as it's not aggravated, I see him returning to peak form within about a week or two returning. And I do think he does return after this IR without any kind of prolonged absence.
How should we be dealing with Saquon as a fantasy manager right now? Is he going to be tip-top shape when he gets back, or is this going to be a lingering injury throughout the season?
Saquon's injury was a little bit interesting because there was a lot of contradictory information that came out. Initially, they said that physical exam testing was optimistic, and then he even got an MRI, and they said that it ruled out a high ankle sprain, and then they didn't even rule him out for that first week that he got injured. He ended up being ruled out, and then about a week later, Saquon Barkley came out himself and said that he did suffer a high ankle sprain. So that's where all this kind of injury analysis gets a little bit complex because we don't really know who to believe in this situation. So we just got to take the concrete details. It does take about 3 weeks minimum to recover from a high ankle sprain. These are not one of the injuries that you're able to play through. And then once you return from that, you are usually limited for about another 1 to 3 weeks. So I would anticipate Saquon being out possibly another week or two if we're going by that high ankle sprain diagnosis. And then I would expect him to be limited. With that being said, if your team is doing well and you're able to hold out for him to make a late season push, by the end of the season, those last kind of 3 to 4 weeks before the playoffs, I think he's going to be back to full speed and able to carry your team over to the fantasy football championship.
I'm going to try to go for him for all my medical issues.
You probably have to play football first.
Oh,
yeah.
All right, guys. Coming up after a short break, we got an update in our one-on-one GOAT lineup situation. You'll see who has won in a close battle last week. That's coming up after a short break. So Jason, this is just a little rule book for everybody at home. This is where you and I go head to head. We test our skills, our knowledge, but we can only pick one player one time throughout the entire season. So if you use, Tutu Atwell, well, you can't use them again.
You can't use them two times.
No, you can't do that. Crazy week, kids. I went against you, Jason, and guess what? I beat you by literally 1 point.
Yeah.
34-06.
33-06. That's crazy. And I really needed that win too, because then we would have been 500.
Yes.
Now 1-3 for me.
Yes, 3-1. It was a close call. Listen, I had 2 guys that basically got 0 points in Samuel and Parham Jr., but Josh Jacobs came through big with me with 23.9 fantasy points.
Yeah, Stafford was my only big win, and that wasn't enough.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So an insane week. Sometimes you have those close calls. As we're entering week 5, though, I'll give you the rundown of who I got in my slot. So I'm actually going with Zach Wilson in New York. I think him facing that Denver defense that is just a disaster. It's a good week to try to go on him. Yeah,
I thought about that.
So I like that. David Montgomery, I'm riding him, especially against a weak Carolina team. And then I got a little firepower from Tyreek Hill. In Miami, and then Taysom Hill. A little symmetry I wanted to use there in that tight end spot.
Okay, so I got Goff, always good in Detroit. I'm going with Breece Hall for the same reason that you're going with Zach Wilson.
Right.
Because the Denver defense. Better play Puka Nacua now, right? So I got him as my wide receiver and Ferguson as my tight end for Dallas.
All right, there you go. Another great week in the books, Jason. A lot to discuss. We're going to see how these injuries go. We'll see you guys next time on the Fantasy Go.